They say a man's tools tell his story. The scratches on the wrench, the oil stains on the workbench, the photos watching over it all like silent sentinels, weathered hands gripping a worn toolbox, knuckles white with determination. Some stories are written in boardrooms and buried in legal briefs. Others are forged in fire, paid for in blood, and measured in the distance between despair and hope. A wheelchair's quiet roll across concrete, a young voice, barely a whisper. They said I'd never walk again. In a world where billion-dollar corporations patent dreams and sell back what God gave us for free, sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. A modest garage on the outskirts of nowhere, where impossible things are about to become inevitable. Sometimes, all it takes is one stubborn mechanic who refuses to accept that anything or anyone is truly broken beyond repair. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Thompson's auto repair, its rays filtering through the dusty windows of the garage where Jack Thompson had spent the better part of his 55 years either learning his trade or perfecting it. The scent of motor oil and metal shavings had become as familiar as his own cologne, which, truth be told, he rarely wore anymore. Jack wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand, leaving a streak across his weathered skin. The digital clock on his workbench read 2:47 p.m., and he'd only had 2 customers all day, a routine oil change and a busted alternator that barely covered his overhead costs. The framed photo of his son Danny, resplendent in his army dress uniform, watched over the workspace from its perch atop his father's old toolbox. 5 years had passed since the knock on his door that changed everything. 2 uniformed officers with expressions that told the story before they spoke a word. 5 years since his boy had stepped on that IED in Afghanistan, saving 3 of his squad members in the process. Jack's wife Sarah hadn't survived the grief, not the cancer that followed 6 months later. Anyway, the doctors said it was aggressive, but Jack knew better. Sometimes a broken heart just stops wanting to fight. Now it was just him, his tools, and a garage that barely broke even most months. The city of Austin was booming around him, tech companies sprouting like wildflowers after rain, condos replacing the old neighborhoods. But Thompson's auto repair remained stubbornly unchanged, an island of authenticity in a sea of progress. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his melancholy. Jack looked up to see a sleek black Tesla Model S pulling into his lot, so out of place among the pickup trucks and aging sedans that it might as well have been a spaceship. The car was worth more than he made in 2 years. The driver's door opened, and a woman emerged with the kind of grace that spoke of money and power. She was probably in her late 40s, wearing a tailored business suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something in her posture, a tightness around her shoulders, a careful control of her movements that suggested she was carrying more than just designer accessories. She walked toward the garage with purpose, her heels clicking authoritatively on the concrete. But as she drew closer, Jack noticed something else. Her eyes, despite their determined focus, held a depth of exhaustion that he recognized. It was the look of someone who'd been fighting a war for too long. "Are you Jack Thompson?" she asked, her voice carrying the polished accent of someone who'd spent time in boardrooms. "Guilty as charged," Jack replied, setting down his wrench. "Though I have to say, you might be the first Tesla owner to darken my doorstep. Most folks with cars like that stick to the dealer service departments." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "I'm Victoria Sterling, and I'm not here about the car." Jack's eyebrows raised. Sterling Industries was one of the biggest renewable energy companies in Texas, and Victoria Sterling was its CEO. Her face had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune more than once. What could a billionaire possibly want with him? "I heard about something you built," she continued, glancing toward the back of the garage where Jack kept his special projects. "A mobility assistance device for Mr. Peterson down the road. Something about a custom walker that responds to muscle movements." Jack followed her gaze to the corner where he tinkered with his side projects. Old Peterson had arthritis so bad he could barely grip his walker, so Jack had rigged up a system of sensors and servos that detected the slightest pressure and provided mechanical assistance. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Word travels fast in small towns, Jack said carefully, though I'm not sure what that has to do with where Mom. The voice came from the Tesla, young and uncertain. Jack looked past Victoria to see a teenage girl in the passenger seat. Even from this distance, he could tell something was wrong with the way she sat too still, too careful. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly. My daughter Sophie, she's... We've been looking for someone who thinks differently about mobility challenges. Jack moved closer to the car, and his heart clenched as he saw the girl more clearly. She was maybe 16, with her mother's intelligent eyes and auburn hair. But there was a wheelchair folded in the back seat that told a story he'd heard too many times. Sophie Sterling was paralyzed. How long? He asked quietly. 2 years, Victoria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Car accident. I was driving. The last three words carried the weight of a confession, and Jack understood immediately why she looked like she was carrying the world on her shoulders. Sophie was watching them through the window, her expression guarded but curious. Jack had seen that look before in the mirror, after Danny died. It was the face of someone who'd learned not to hope too much. What have the doctors said? Jack asked. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Everything that money can buy, spinal cord injury, complete paralysis from L2 down. We've consulted with specialists from Johns Hopkins to the Mayo Clinic, experimental treatments, stem cell therapy, everything. She paused, looking at her daughter. Nothing. Jack studied the girl in the car. Sophie was watching their conversation with the intensity of someone whose life hung in the balance of every word. There was intelligence in her eyes, and something else, a spark that hadn't been entirely extinguished. She was a basketball player, Victoria continued. Varsity team, full scholarship prospects. Basketball was her whole world. And now she barely leaves her room. Victoria's voice broke slightly. She's given up, Mr. Thompson, and I don't know how to help her get it back. Jack walked over to the Tesla and tapped gently on the passenger window. Sophie looked startled for a moment, then rolled it down with the touch of a button. Sophie, Jack said, crouching down to her eye level. I'm Jack. She nodded, still guarded. My mom thinks you can build me robot legs or something. Jack chuckled. Robot legs, that sounds pretty cool. Actually, but before we talk about building anything, I've got a question for you. Sophie waited. Do you miss it basketball? I mean, for the first time, Sophie's careful mask slipped. Jack saw a flash of raw pain cross her face before she composed herself again. You can't miss something you'll never be able to do again. Who told you that? Everyone, Sophie replied flatly. Doctors, therapists, reality. Jack was quiet for a moment, then smiled. You know, I used to be in the Army, combat engineer, and one thing we learned was that when someone tells you something's impossible, it usually just means they don't have the right tools or the right perspective. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you saying the doctors are wrong? I'm saying maybe they're thinking about the problem in the wrong way. Jack stood up and gestured toward his garage. Mind if I show you something? Sophie looked at her mother, who nodded. Victoria retrieved the wheelchair from the back seat with practiced efficiency, and soon Sophie was seated in it, allowing herself to be wheeled into the garage. Jack led them to his workbench, where the components of his latest project were scattered across the surface. Motors, sensors, control boards, and frame pieces that looked like they belonged in either a medical facility or a science fiction movie. What is all this? Sophie asked. Her interest clearly piqued despite herself. Been working on something for a while now, Jack explained. See, the problem with most mobility devices is they try to do all the work, but the human body is an incredible machine. Even when it's damaged, there's usually something left to work with. He picked up a servo motor, no bigger than his thumb. This little guy can generate about 20 pounds of force. Doesn't sound like much, but if you use it to amplify existing muscle movement instead of replacing it entirely. Sophie leaned forward in her wheelchair. You mean like a power suit? Exactly like a power suit. Jack's eyes lit up. Your muscles send signals, even if they can't move your legs anymore. We capture those signals, amplify them, and translate them into mechanical movement. You're still in control. The machine just gives you the strength to do what you're already trying to do. Victoria stepped closer, her business instincts engaged. The medical community has been working on exoskeletons for years. They're bulky, expensive, and limited in their applications. Because they're thinking like doctors, Jack replied. I'm thinking like an engineer, and more importantly, like someone who's seen what determination can accomplish when it's got the right tools. Sophie was studying the components with growing fascination. How would it work, I mean, specifically? Jack's grin widened. Here was the question he'd been hoping for. Well, first we'd need to map your existing muscle control. Even with paralysis, there are usually micro movements, electrical impulses that we can detect and interpret. Then we design a frame system that works with your body instead of trying to replace it. He began sketching rapidly on a notepad, his pencil flying across the paper as the design took shape. Lightweight carbon fiber frame, distributed along your legs and hips, servo-assisted joints at the knees and ankles, sensors to read your muscle signals and translate them into movement commands. Sophie watched the drawing evolve, and for the first time in their conversation, Jack saw something he hadn't expected. Hope. How long would something like that take to build? Victoria asked. Jack looked up from his sketch. With the right components and enough coffee, maybe 6 weeks. But I have to be honest with you. This isn't like fixing a car. There's no guarantee it'll work. And even if it does, it'll need constant adjustment and refinement. What about cost? Victoria pressed. Jack shrugged. Materials. Maybe 5,000. My time. He looked at Sophie, still studying his drawing with intense concentration. Let's just say I've got some time on my hands these days. Victoria stared at him. You're talking about potentially changing my daughter's life, and you want $5,000. I'm talking about trying to help a young woman get back something she lost, Jack corrected. The money's just for parts. Sophie looked up from the drawing. When could we start? Jack glanced around his garage, taking in the familiar chaos of tools and projects, the photos of Danny watching over it all. Sometimes life offered you a chance to matter again, to use your skills for something bigger than yourself. How about tomorrow morning, he said. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made Jack remember why he'd fallen in love with Texas autumns. Sophie and Victoria pulled into the garage lot at exactly 8:00 a.m., and Jack could see that both women had come prepared for work. Victoria in jeans and a company polo shirt, Sophie in athletic wear that made Jack's heart ache for all the games she should have been playing. I brought coffee, Victoria announced, holding up a carrier tray from a local shop. And breakfast tacos. Figured we'd need fuel. Jack accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Victoria had somehow remembered he took it black, despite never asking. CEO instincts. Probably the ability to read people and situations quickly. Sophie wheeled herself over to the workbench where Jack had spent the previous evening organizing components and refining his designs. Did you work on this all night, she asked, studying the detailed schematics he'd drawn up. Old habits, Jack replied. Military teaches you to plan everything twice and check it 3 times, especially when lives depend on getting it right. Were you deployed? Sophie asked with the casual directness of her generation. Afghanistan, Iraq, and a few places that don't officially exist, Jack said. Combat engineer, building bridges, clearing roads, making things work in places where nothing was supposed to work. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. My uncle was in Afghanistan. He said it was like solving impossible puzzles under pressure. Jack felt a small chill. What was your uncle's name? Marcus Sterling. He was in the 82nd Airborne. Sophie's voice carried a note of pride mixed with old sadness. He didn't make it home. Jack set down his coffee, his hands suddenly unsteady. Marcus Sterling. The name hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a flood of memories from a dusty forward operating base near Kandahar. When he asked quietly, Victoria noticed the change in his voice. March 2019. His unit was trying to evacuate civilians from a compound when it was attacked. He stayed behind to help the wounded get out. Jack closed his eyes, remembering the compound evacuation, the IED that had been waiting for the rescue team. His son Danny had been part of the unit that responded to the distress call, the unit that had fought their way through enemy fire to pull out survivors. My son was there, Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Danny Thompson. He was part of the response team that came for your uncle's unit. The garage fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Victoria's face had gone pale. The medic, she whispered. The one who... She couldn't finish the sentence. The one who stepped on the IED while carrying wounded soldiers to safety. Jack completed. Yeah, that was my boy. Sophie's hands had stilled on the wheelchair's armrests. Your son saved my uncle, and 5 other soldiers. Jack nodded. Marcus Sterling was one of the men Danny died protecting. Victoria sank into a nearby chair, her composure finally cracking. Oh God, Jack, I had no idea. If I had known, you'd have not asked for help. Jack shook his head. Victoria, Marcus Sterling was a good man. Danny wrote about him in his last letter, said he was the kind of soldier who put everyone else first. If he was Sophie's uncle, then helping her isn't just the right thing to do, it's an honor. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I barely remember him. I was so young when he died. But Mom has pictures, and she always said he would have loved to see me play basketball. Jack looked at the girl, seeing not just a patient, but a connection to his son's legacy. Danny had died to save soldiers like Marcus Sterling, and now Jack had a chance to help Marcus Sterling's niece walk again. The symmetry felt like more than coincidence. Well then, Jack said, forcing his voice to remain steady, I guess we'd better build something that would make both of them proud. The work began in earnest. Jack had planned to start with basic measurements and muscle response testing, but Sophie surprised him by arriving with a detailed journal documenting her physical therapy experiences, her remaining muscle control, and her observations about different mobility devices she'd tried. Most of them try to do everything for you, she explained, flipping through pages of neat handwriting. But I've noticed that when I try to move, even though nothing happens, I can feel my muscles attempting to respond. Like the signals are there. They just can't get through. Victoria watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. She's been documenting everything for months. I think she was hoping to find patterns that the doctors missed. Jack studied Sophie's notes, impressed by their thoroughness. These observations are incredibly valuable. You've basically done half the diagnostic work already. He looked up at her with growing respect. Have you ever considered studying biomedical engineering? Sophie's laugh was rueful. Kind of hard to plan for college when you're not sure you'll ever walk across a stage. Walking across stages is overrated, Jack said firmly. But using your brain to solve problems, that's never going out of style. They spent the morning taking precise measurements and testing Sophie's existing muscle responses with a borrowed EMG machine that Jack had somehow procured overnight. Victoria didn't ask where he'd gotten it, but she suspected his military connections ran deeper than he'd let on. The afternoon was devoted to beginning construction of the frame. Jack had decided to start with the leg assemblies, building them modularly so they could be tested and refined individually before integration into the full system. Why carbon fiber? Sophie asked, watching Jack carefully cut and shape the lightweight material. Strength to weight ratio, Jack explained. Steel would be stronger, but you'd be carrying around 50 extra pounds. Aluminum would be lighter, but not strong enough for the stress loads. Carbon fiber gives us the best of both worlds. Victoria found herself drawn into the technical discussion despite her initial skepticism. Her background was in renewable energy, but the engineering principles were similar enough that she could follow along and even contribute suggestions. What about power consumption? She asked. Those servo motors can't run indefinitely. Jack nodded approvingly. Good catch. I'm designing the system to be as efficient as possible, using Sophie's existing muscle contractions to do most of the work and only providing assistance when needed. But we'll still need a battery pack. How big, Sophie wanted to know. About the size of a paperback book, worn at the waist. Should give you 4 to 6 hours of continuous operation. Sophie made a note in her journal. What happens if it runs out of power while I'm using it? The frame locks in a stable position automatically. You won't fall, but you won't be able to move until you can recharge or swap batteries. Victoria appreciated the safety consideration, but she was thinking like a business person. What about backup systems redundancy? Already planned for, Jack replied. Dual motor systems on each joint, independent control circuits, and mechanical safeties that engage if anything goes wrong. As the day progressed, Jack found himself increasingly impressed by both women. Victoria's questions were sharp and practical, forcing him to think through problems he might have overlooked. Sophie's insights into the human side of the equation, how it would feel to use the device, what movements would be most important to regain, were invaluable in refining the design. More importantly, working with them was healing something in Jack that he hadn't realized was broken. For the first time since Danny's death, he felt like his skills mattered, like he was building something that would make a real difference in the world. By late afternoon, they had completed the basic frame structure for one leg. It was rough and unfinished, but the essential components were in place: the carbon fiber structure, the servo-assisted joints, and the mounting points for sensors. Can we test it? Sophie asked eagerly. Jack hesitated. It's not really ready for a full test. We don't have the control systems integrated yet, and I don't need it to work perfectly. Sophie interrupted. I just want to see if it feels right. Victoria looked concerned. Honey, maybe we should wait until… Mom. Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. I've been waiting for 2 years. I need to know if this is going to work. Jack looked at the partial assembly, then at Sophie's determined expression. Sometimes in engineering, as in life, you had to trust your instincts and take calculated risks. All right, he said, but we do this carefully. Manual operation only, no motors, no electronics. Just seeing how the mechanical structure fits and feels. Kuraninoin. With Victoria's help, they carefully fitted the prototype to Sophie's left leg. The carbon fiber frame extended from her hip to her ankle, held in place by padded straps and mounting points. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, but it also looked surprisingly natural. How does it feel? Jack asked. Sophie moved her leg experimentally, the mechanical joints following the motion smoothly. It's lighter than I expected, and the fit is… She paused, searching for words. It doesn't feel foreign, like… I can tell it's there, but it doesn't feel wrong. Jack nodded, making notes on his tablet. Good. That means the articulation points are in the right places. When we add the servo assistance, the movement should feel natural rather than mechanical. Victoria watched her daughter move with the prototype, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw something in Sophie's face that had been missing: genuine excitement about the possibility of movement. When will the electronic systems be ready? Sophie asked. Jack looked at his timeline notes. If everything goes according to plan, maybe 2 weeks for basic functionality. But Sophie… He met her eyes seriously. I need you to understand that this is experimental. There's no guarantee it'll work the way we hope. And even if it does, it'll take time to learn how to use it effectively. Sophie nodded solemnly. I understand, but Mr. Thompson, Jack, even if it only works a little bit, even if I can just stand up under my own power, that would be everything. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. Danny had written in his letters about the satisfaction of helping people, of using his skills to make impossible things possible. Now Jack was beginning to understand what his son had meant. Then we'd better get back to work, he said. 2 weeks later, Jack stood in his garage at 5:30 a.m., surrounded by the scattered components of what he hoped would be Sophie's completed mobility system. He'd been working since midnight, running final diagnostics and making last-minute adjustments to the control algorithms. Today was the day they would attempt the first full system test. The electronic control unit sat on his workbench like the brain of some mechanical creature, its circuit boards dense with processors and sensors. Jack had spent countless hours programming the response patterns, creating a system that could interpret Sophie's muscle signals and translate them into precise motor movements. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Running late, Sophie couldn't sleep too excited. Be there by 7. Jack smiled despite his exhaustion. Sophie's enthusiasm had been infectious over the past 2 weeks, pushing him to work longer hours and solve problems faster than he'd thought possible. She'd become a true partner in the project, documenting every test and offering insights that had led to several crucial improvements. The sound of tires on gravel announced their arrival. Through the garage's open door, Jack watched Victoria help Sophie transfer from the car to her wheelchair. But something was different this morning. Both women moved with a nervous energy that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting anticipation. Please tell me you have good news, Victoria said as they approached, her CEO composure barely masking her anxiety. Jack gestured to the completed exoskeleton hanging on a specialized frame he'd built. The final product was sleek and purposeful, its carbon fiber components gleaming under the garage's fluorescent lights. The leg assemblies were connected by a lightweight hip unit, and the whole system was designed to integrate seamlessly with Sophie's existing muscle structure. Holy shit, Sophie breathed, then immediately looked embarrassed. Sorry, Mom. Victoria was too busy staring at the device to notice her daughter's language. It's beautiful, she said softly. I mean, it's functional and clean, and God, Jack, it actually looks like it could work. Jack nodded, though he was too nervous to fully appreciate the compliment. All the systems check out in simulation. Motor response times are within acceptable parameters. The neural interface is calibrated to Sophie's specific muscle patterns, and the safety systems are triple redundant. But, Sophie prompted, recognizing the hesitation in his voice. But there's a difference between theory and practice, Jack admitted. Until we actually test it with you wearing it, we won't know if all these individual components work together the way they're supposed to. Sophie wheeled herself closer to the exoskeleton, studying it with the intensity of someone whose future hung in the balance. Walk me through it one more time. How does it actually work? Jack appreciated her need to understand every detail. It was the same methodical approach that had made him a good engineer and had probably kept him alive in combat zones. The sensors detect electrical impulses from your muscle groups, he explained, pointing to the nearly invisible sensor arrays. Those signals get processed by the control unit, which determines your intended movement and sends commands to the appropriate servo motors. The motors provide just enough assistance to execute the movement you're trying to make. What if I try to move in a way that could cause injury? Sophie asked. The system has built-in limits based on safe biomechanical ranges. It won't let you hyperextend joints or put dangerous stress on your spine. Think of it as having an automatic safety coach built in. Victoria stepped closer, her business instincts engaged. What about malfunction scenarios? What if the electronics fail? Mechanical locks engage automatically if power is lost or if the system detects an anomaly. Jack replied, You'd be immobilized until the issue is resolved, but you wouldn't fall or be injured. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Jack with an expression of determined trust. I'm ready to try it. The fitting process took nearly an hour. Each component had to be precisely positioned and secured, with sensor placement being particularly critical. Jack worked with the careful concentration of a surgeon, double-checking every connection and calibration point. Victoria documented everything with her phone, partly for record-keeping, but mostly because she needed something to do with her hands while her daughter prepared for what could be the most important moment of her life. How does it feel? Jack asked as he made final adjustments to the hip unit. Heavier than the prototype, Sophie replied, but not uncomfortably so. The sensors feel weird like little electric tickles. That's normal. The system is learning your baseline muscle activity patterns. It should settle down once calibration is complete. Jack moved to his control tablet, watching readouts scroll past as the exoskeleton systems came online. Heart rate monitors, muscle response sensors, joint angle feedback, all the data points he'd need to ensure Sophie's safety during the test. All systems show green, he announced. Sophie, I want you to start small. Just try to tense the muscles you'd normally use to stand up. Don't worry about actually standing. We're just testing the signal pathways. Sophie closed her eyes, concentrating. On Jack's tablet, lines of data began dancing across the screen as the sensors detected her muscle activity. The exoskeleton responded with barely perceptible movements, servo motors humming softly as they translated intention into motion. I can feel it, Sophie whispered, wonder evident in her voice. It's like the machine knows what I'm trying to do. Victoria moved closer, watching her daughter's legs twitch with the first voluntary movement they'd shown in 2 years. Tears began streaming down her face despite her efforts to maintain composure. Okay, Jack said, his voice steady despite his own excitement. Let's try something a little more ambitious. Sophie, I want you to imagine standing up, but don't force it. Just let the thought guide your muscle responses. Sophie nodded, her face showing intense concentration. On the tablet, Jack watched as her muscle patterns shifted into the complex sequence associated with standing. The exoskeleton responded immediately, servo motors engaging with precisely calibrated force. Slowly, incredibly. Sophie began to rise from her wheelchair. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sophie's eyes flew open as she felt herself ascending, the exoskeleton translating her neural commands into smooth, controlled movement. Oh my God, Sophie breathed. Oh my God, I'm standing. She was indeed standing, not perfectly, not without assistance, but standing nonetheless. The exoskeleton held her upright while responding to her body's natural balance adjustments. Her legs, which had been motionless for 2 years, were now supporting her weight with mechanical precision. Jack monitored the data streams, ready to shut down the system at the first sign of trouble, but everything looked perfect. Muscle response was within normal parameters. Joint stress was well below safety limits, and most importantly, Sophie was in complete control. How do you feel? He asked. Sophie looked down at her legs, then at her mother, then at Jack. Like I'm 6 feet tall again, she said, laughing through tears. God, I forgot how different the world looks from up here. Victoria couldn't contain herself any longer. She rushed forward and embraced her standing daughter, both of them crying and laughing simultaneously. Can I try taking a step? Sophie asked. Jack hesitated. Standing was one thing, but walking required dynamic balance and coordinated movement across multiple joints. The complexity increased exponentially. Maybe we should master standing first, he suggested cautiously. Sophie gave him a look that reminded him strongly of his own son's stubborn determination. Jack, I've been sitting down for 2 years. I think I've mastered that part. Please, against his better engineering judgment, Jack found himself nodding. One step, small and slow. If anything feels wrong, stop immediately. Sophie took a deep breath, then concentrated on the simple act of shifting her weight forward. The exoskeleton responded beautifully, maintaining her balance while translating her intention into movement. Her right foot lifted, moved forward 6 inches, and planted firmly on the ground. Holy shit, she said again, this time not bothering to apologize for her language. Victoria was recording everything on her phone, tears making it difficult to hold the device steady. Sophie, baby, you're walking. You're actually walking. One step, Jack corrected, though he was grinning broadly. But it's a hell of a good step. Sophie looked at him with playful defiance. What's the rule about making a mechanical engineer happy? I don't know. What? Give them something that works better than expected. She shifted her weight again, and this time her left foot moved forward. 2 steps, then 3. By the 5th step, Jack realized that Sophie wasn't just walking, she was walking naturally, the exoskeleton responding to her intentions so seamlessly that it looked like an extension of her own body rather than a mechanical device. "I need to sit down," Victoria said weakly, though she kept recording. "This is incredible, Jack. This is absolutely incredible." But Jack was watching his data streams with growing excitement. The neural integration was even better than he'd hoped. Sophie's muscle patterns were clear and strong, and the exoskeleton was learning her movement preferences in real time, making micro adjustments that improved performance with each step. "Sophie," he said, "I want you to try something. Think about walking to the other side of the garage. Don't plan each step, just think about going there, and let your body figure out how." Sophie nodded and began walking with increasing confidence. The exoskeleton moved with her like a perfectly trained dance partner, providing support and amplification without ever taking control away from her. By the time she reached the far wall and turned around, she was moving with something approaching her old athletic grace. 20 steps, Victoria counted. 20 perfect steps. Sophie walked back to them, her face radiant with joy and possibility. "Jack," she said, "I don't know how to thank you." Jack looked at this remarkable young woman who had just taken her first steps in 2 years, thought about his son Danny and the legacy of service he tried to live up to, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for a long time. "You just did," he said. The video Victoria posted to social media the next morning changed everything. What had started as a simple documentation of Sophie's first steps became something larger when Victoria decided to share their story with the world. The caption was simple: "My daughter walks again, thanks to a Vietnam veteran in Austin who believed in possibilities when doctors saw only limitations." Within 6 hours, the video had 10,000 views. By the end of the day, it had reached 100,000. Local news stations began calling, followed by national outlets. Jack's quiet garage was suddenly the center of a media storm he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he wanted. "CNN wants to do a feature story," Victoria announced, scrolling through her phone as they gathered in the garage the following morning. "And I've got interview requests from 3 major networks." Jack was focused on calibrating Sophie's exoskeleton for their daily practice session, but he could feel the weight of unwanted attention pressing down on him. "I didn't sign up for this circus," he muttered. Sophie, now able to stand and move with increasing confidence, looked between her mother and Jack with concern. "Maybe we should slow down with the publicity. This is still experimental, right? What if something goes wrong?" Victoria set down her phone and looked at both of them seriously. "I understand the concerns, but you need to see the messages I'm getting. Parents from all over the country asking if there's hope for their children. Veterans with spinal injuries wanting to know if the technology could help them. Jack, what you've built here, it's not just about Sophie anymore." Jack sighed, knowing Victoria was right but feeling overwhelmed by the implications. He'd spent his whole life working in relative obscurity, solving problems one at a time. The idea of scaling up his work to help thousands of people was both exhilarating and terrifying. "The infrastructure doesn't exist," he said. "This isn't like manufacturing cars on an assembly line. Each device has to be custom-built, individually calibrated. It takes weeks of work for every single person." "Then we build the infrastructure," Victoria replied with the confidence of someone who'd built a billion-dollar company from scratch. "We create training programs, establish manufacturing partnerships, develop standardized components that can be customized for individual needs." Sophie had been practicing walking while they talked, and now she stopped to face them both. "Before we get ahead of ourselves, shouldn't we make sure this actually works long-term? I've been using the system for exactly 3 days. What if there are problems we haven't discovered yet?" Jack appreciated her caution. It echoed his own engineering instincts. "Sophie's right. We need more data, longer trials, medical oversight. This is still experimental technology." His phone rang, interrupting the discussion. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but lately that had been happening a lot. "Thompson's Auto Repair," he answered automatically. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Patricia Chen from the Austin Rehabilitation Institute. I saw the video of your work with Sophie Sterling, and I'd like to discuss a potential collaboration." Jack put the call on speaker. What kind of collaboration? Dr. Chen. We have a patient, a young veteran named Miguel Santos. IED explosion. Similar injury profile to Sophie's. He's been struggling with conventional rehabilitation. And frankly, we're running out of options. Would you be willing to consult on his case? Jack looked at Victoria and Sophie, both of whom were nodding encouragingly. I'd need to understand his specific situation, run diagnostics, develop a custom solution. Of course, and Mr. Thompson, we'd be prepared to compensate you appropriately for your time and expertise. This isn't charity work. We recognize the value of what you've developed. After ending the call, the three of them sat in contemplative silence. The request represented both an opportunity and a responsibility that none of them had fully anticipated. How do you feel about taking on another case? Victoria asked carefully. Jack thought about Miguel Santos, a young veteran probably not much older than Danny would have been, someone who'd sacrificed for his country and was now struggling with challenges that conventional medicine couldn't solve. One more case, he said finally, but we do it right. Full medical oversight, careful documentation, and if anything goes wrong, we stop immediately. Sophie smiled approvingly. And I can help with the design process. My experience might be useful for someone else learning to use the system. Victoria was already making notes on her tablet. I'll handle the logistics and funding. And I think it's time we started documenting everything properly, building a knowledge base that other engineers could use. 3 days later, Miguel Santos arrived at the garage. He was 24 years old, broad-shouldered despite his wheelchair, with the alert eyes of someone who'd learned to be constantly aware of his surroundings. Jack recognized the bearing immediately. This was a soldier, even in civilian clothes. Mr. Thompson, Miguel said, extending his hand with a firm grip. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Dr. Chen showed me the video of Sophie, and honestly, it's the first time I've felt hopeful about anything in months. Jack shook his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hours spent in physical therapy. Call me Jack, and before we talk about building anything, I want to understand your situation, what happened, what you've tried, what your goals are. Miguel's story was all too familiar. An IED explosion during a patrol in Syria had left him with a complete spinal cord injury at the L3 level. He'd spent 8 months in military hospitals, followed by another 6 months in civilian rehabilitation centers, trying every available therapy and assistive technology. The problem with everything I've tried, Miguel explained, is that it makes me feel like a passenger in my own body. The devices do all the work, and I just go along for the ride. I was a soldier. Man, I need to feel like I'm in control. Sophie, who had been listening intently, wheeled closer. That's exactly how I felt about traditional mobility devices, like they were doing things to me instead of with me. Jack nodded, understanding the distinction immediately. Miguel, walk me through a typical day in your wheelchair. What movements do you miss most? What would you prioritize if you could only regain limited functionality? Miguel's answer surprised him. Standing up when someone enters a room. Sounds simple, but when you're always looking up at people, you feel diminished. And honestly, I'd love to be able to shoot hoops again. Basketball was my thing before the Army. Sophie's eyes lit up. Mine too. I was varsity in high school, had scholarship offers. Jack watched the two young people connect over their shared experience, and an idea began forming in his mind. What if we designed your system with basketball specifically in mind? The movements, the balance requirements, the quick directional changes. Is that possible? Miguel asked. Everything's possible until proven otherwise, Jack replied, echoing one of Danny's favorite phrases. But it would mean building something different from Sophie's design. More responsive, probably more powerful, optimized for athletic movement rather than just walking. Victoria had been taking notes throughout the conversation. What about development timeline, cost considerations? Jack was already sketching preliminary ideas. Miguel's injury is similar to Sophie's, so we can use her system as a baseline. But the customization for athletic movement would require extensive testing and refinement, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. I've got time, Miguel said simply, and Dr. Chen's program will cover the expenses. The VA is very interested in alternative rehabilitation approaches. Sophie stood up using her exoskeleton, the movement now smooth and natural after days of practice. Miguel, would you like to see how this works? Maybe get a sense of what's possible. Jack spent the next hour demonstrating Sophie's system, explaining the neural interface technology, and showing how the exoskeleton responded to muscle signals. Miguel asked intelligent questions that showed he understood the technical challenges involved. The biggest difference for your system, Jack explained, would be response time and power output. Basketball requires quick movements and sudden changes of direction. We'd need faster processors and more powerful motors. What about durability? Miguel wanted to know. I mean, if I'm going to be playing sports in this thing, it needs to handle impact and stress. Jack grinned. Miguel, I built this technology using principles I learned maintaining equipment in combat zones. Durability isn't optional. It's built into the DNA of every component. By the end of the session, they had outlined a development plan for Miguel's custom system. It would be more complex than Sophie's design, but Jack was confident it was achievable. More importantly, he was excited about the challenge. As Miguel prepared to leave, he paused at the garage entrance. Jack, I need you to know something. When I got injured, I thought my life was basically over. The doctors told me to focus on adaptation and acceptance. You're the first person who's talked about possibility instead of limitation. Jack thought about Danny, about the letters his son had written about helping people in impossible situations. Miguel, sometimes the best solutions come from people who don't know enough to accept the conventional wisdom. We're going to build you something that works. After Miguel left, Victoria approached Jack with an expression he'd learned to recognize her CEO face, the one that appeared when she was thinking strategically. What? Jack asked warily. 2 cases doesn't constitute a coincidence, she said. It constitutes the beginning of a pattern. Jack, I think we need to start thinking bigger. Sophie, overhearing, nodded agreement. Mom's right. If this technology can help me and Miguel, it can probably help hundreds of other people, maybe thousands. Jack looked around his garage, taking in the familiar chaos of tools and projects, the photos of Danny watching over everything. 6 months ago, his biggest concern had been keeping the lights on and finding enough work to pay his bills. Now he was apparently on the verge of revolutionizing rehabilitation technology. One step at a time, he said finally. Let's get Miguel walking, document everything we learn, and then figure out what comes next. But even as he said it, Jack could feel the tide of change pulling him towards something larger than he'd ever imagined. The question wasn't whether he would rise to meet it. The question was whether he was ready for everything that would come with success. The breakthrough came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November. Jack was alone in the garage, fine-tuning Miguel's motor response algorithms when everything suddenly clicked into place. The young veteran had been making steady progress over the past month, but there had been persistent issues with balance during quick movements, the kind of split-second adjustments that made the difference between walking and actually playing basketball. Jack had been experimenting with predictive algorithms, programming the system to anticipate movement patterns based on neural signal trends rather than just reacting to them. The concept was simple in theory, but fiendishly complex in execution, requiring the exoskeleton to essentially learn Miguel's movement intentions before Miguel himself was fully conscious of them. On his computer screen, lines of code scrolled past as he ran another simulation. The test parameters were based on basketball-specific movements, quick direction changes, jumping motions, the complex balance adjustments required for shooting. For weeks, the system had been close but not quite right, always a fraction of a second behind Miguel's intentions, creating a lag that made natural movement impossible. Then, suddenly, the simulation results changed. Response times dropped to milliseconds. Balance calculations became smooth and fluid. The virtual Miguel was not just walking, but running, jumping, pivoting with athletic grace. Jack stared at the screen, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. He ran the simulation again, then a third time. The results were consistent somehow. The latest algorithm revision had solved the fundamental challenge of real-time neural interface control. His phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about tomorrow's test. Any chance we could start early?" Jack glanced at the clock and realized that tomorrow was technically today. He texted back, "How early can you get here?" The response was immediate. "Give me 30 minutes." Miguel arrived with Dr. Chen in tow, both of them looking like they'd been awake for hours. Miguel had been making impressive progress with the prototype system, but they'd reached a plateau where he could walk smoothly but couldn't handle the dynamic movements required for sports. "Please tell me you have good news," Miguel said, eyeing the excitement barely contained in Jack's expression. "I have potentially revolutionary news," Jack replied, pulling up the simulation results. "The new algorithms don't just respond to your movement intentions, they predict them. We've essentially eliminated the lag between thought and action." Dr. Chen leaned forward to study the data. That should be impossible. Neural signal processing has inherent delays. The fastest systems we've tested still have response times measured in hundreds of milliseconds." "Not anymore," Jack said, and he couldn't keep the pride out of his voice. "By analyzing signal patterns and learning your specific neural signatures, the system can start responding to movement commands before they're fully formed. It's like the exoskeleton knows what you want to do before you do." Miguel was already moving toward the testing area where his exoskeleton waited. "Can we try it? I mean, is it safe?" Jack nodded, though he felt the familiar flutter of nerves that came with testing new technology. "All the safety systems are unchanged. If anything goes wrong, the mechanical locks engage automatically." The fitting process had become routine over the past month, but today felt different. There was an anticipation in the air, a sense that they were approaching something significant. "How does it feel?" Jack asked as Miguel stood up in the upgraded system. Miguel paused, concentrating on the subtle sensations of the neural interface. "Different, more responsive somehow, like it's listening more carefully." Jack watched the data streams on his tablet, noting the improved signal clarity and faster processing times. "Try walking to the far wall, but think about it differently. Instead of planning each step, just think about where you want to go and let your body figure out how to get there." Miguel began walking, and immediately everyone could see the difference. His movements were more fluid, more natural, where before there had been a subtle mechanical quality to his gait. Now he moved with something approaching his old athletic grace. "Holy shit," Miguel breathed, echoing Sophie's favorite expression. "It's like the machine is reading my mind." Dr. Chen was furiously taking notes. "The integration between human and mechanical systems is remarkable. Miguel, how much conscious effort are you putting into controlling the device?" "Almost none," Miguel replied, still walking with increasing confidence. "I think about moving, and it happens. It's like—" He paused, searching for the right analogy. "Like driving a car that you know really well. You don't think about steering or braking, you just think about where you want to go." Jack felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with awe. This was beyond what he'd hoped for when he'd started the project with Sophie. They weren't just restoring mobility, they were creating true human-machine integration. "Miguel," he said carefully, "how do you feel about trying something more challenging?" Miguel grinned. "What did you have in mind?" Jack gestured toward the basketball hoop he'd installed in the garage's back corner, partly for testing purposes, but mostly because Miguel had mentioned how much he missed shooting hoops. "Want to see if you can take a shot?" The walk to the basketball was Miguel's longest sustained movement in the new system, and he covered the distance with increasing confidence. When he picked up the ball, Jack noted how the exoskeleton automatically adjusted to accommodate the change balance requirements. Miguel dribbled the ball experimentally. The system responded perfectly to the subtle weight shifts and balance adjustments required. Then he looked up at the hoop, took a deep breath, and shot. The ball arced through the air and swished through the net with barely a sound. Dr. Chen gasped. Miguel stared at the basket in disbelief. Jack felt tears prick his eyes as he thought about Danny, about second chances, about the miraculous things that became possible when technology served human dreams rather than replacing them. I made a basket, Miguel said quietly. I actually made a basket. Before Jack could respond, his phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID. Jack! Victoria's voice was tight with urgency. You need to see the news. Something's happened. Jack put the call on speaker. What kind of something? The video of Sophie walking has been picked up by every major network. But that's not the problem. The problem is that Meridian Medical Technologies just announced they're developing an identical system. They're claiming they've been working on it for years. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Meridian Medical was one of the largest medical device manufacturers in the world, with resources that dwarfed anything he could imagine. That's impossible, he said. The neural interface technology is completely proprietary. I developed it from scratch. Jack, Victoria's voice was grim. They're not just claiming they developed similar technology. They're claiming you stole their research. They've filed patent infringement lawsuits against us and are seeking an injunction to stop all further development. The garage fell silent except for the hum of Miguel's exoskeleton systems. Jack looked at Miguel, still standing with the basketball in his hands, representing everything they'd accomplished and everything that was now at risk. How is that possible? Dr. Chen asked. Jack's work is completely original. Money and lawyers make a lot of impossible things possible, Victoria replied. Jack, I need you to gather every piece of documentation you have about the development process. Every sketch, every email, every test result. We're going to have to prove that your work came first. Jack thought about his notebooks, his design sketches, the photos and videos documenting every step of Sophie's and Miguel's progress. The evidence was there, but fighting a legal battle with a corporation like Meridian would require resources he didn't have. Victoria, he said quietly, I can't afford to fight something like this. Maybe we should just... No! Miguel's voice cut through Jack's uncertainty with military sharpness. Jack, you gave me my life back. You don't get to quit just because some corporate assholes want to steal your work. Dr. Chen nodded agreement. Miguel's right. This technology is too important to let it be buried in legal proceedings or corporate bureaucracy. Jack looked around his garage, taking in the tools and projects that represented a lifetime of solving problems and helping people. Danny's photo watched from the workbench, a reminder of the legacy of service that had brought Jack to this moment. All right, he said finally, but we're going to need help. More help than I know how to ask for. Victoria's voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. Jack, you've been thinking like a mechanic trying to help one person at a time. It's time to start thinking like someone who's about to change the world. And changing the world means being ready to fight for it. As if to punctuate her words, Miguel sank another basket, the ball swishing through the net with a sound that spoke of dreams reclaimed and possibilities defended. The war for the future of adaptive mobility technology had begun. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in the hallway and reporters setting up cameras on the courthouse steps. What had started as a patent dispute had evolved into something much larger, a David versus Goliath story that had captured national attention. On one side sat the legal team from Meridian Medical Technologies, a phalanx of expensive suits surrounding their chief technology officer, Dr. Richard Vaughn. Their table was covered with thick binders and laptops, the weapons of corporate warfare. On the other side, Jack sat with a much smaller team. Victoria had hired the best intellectual property attorney her money could buy, but they were still dramatically outgunned. Sophie and Miguel flanked Jack, both wearing their exoskeletons as silent testimony to the technology at the heart of the dispute. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, her expression stern as she surveyed the packed courtroom. This case involves allegations of patent infringement and trade secret theft related to adaptive mobility assistance technology. Given the significant public interest, I'll be allowing limited media coverage. Meridian's lead attorney, James Bradford III, rose to present their opening argument. He was everything Jack had expected from a corporate lawyer, perfectly groomed, supremely confident, and armed with charts and graphics designed to overwhelm with complexity. Your Honor, Bradford began, Meridian Medical Technologies has invested over $50 million and 5 years of research into developing revolutionary neural interface technology for mobility assistance. Mr. Thompson's device represents a clear theft of our proprietary algorithms and control systems. He clicked a remote, and a timeline appeared on the courtroom's display screen. Our patent applications date back 3 years. Our research documentation shows continuous development since 2019. Mr. Thompson's work, by contrast, began only 6 months ago, immediately following a documented visit to our research facility by Ms. Victoria Sterling. Jack felt his stomach drop. He glanced at Victoria, who looked pale but determined. Bradford continued his presentation with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. Furthermore, we have testimony from former employees indicating that confidential research data was shared with outside parties, specifically mentioning Mr. Thompson's project. The attorney gestured toward Dr. Vaughn. Dr. Vaughn will testify that the neural interface algorithms in Mr. Thompson's device are virtually identical to our proprietary code, down to specific variable names and commenting structures. Jack's attorney, Sarah Kim, rose for their defense. She was younger than Bradford, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was fighting for more than just legal victory. Your Honor, Kim began, this case represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how innovation actually works. Mr. Thompson's technology wasn't stolen from Meridian. It was developed independently in his garage using principles he learned during 20 years of military engineering service. She gestured toward Jack. Mr. Thompson is a combat engineer who spent his career solving impossible problems in impossible circumstances. The technology we're discussing today grew from his desire to help a young woman walk again, not from any corporate research program. Kim clicked her own remote, displaying a timeline of Jack's work. Every step of Mr. Thompson's development process is documented through photos, videos, design sketches, and third-party witnesses. His first conversation with Sophie Sterling was recorded. His early prototypes were photographed. His testing sessions were witnessed by medical professionals. She paused, letting the weight of documentation sink in. More importantly, Mr. Thompson's approach to neural interface control is fundamentally different from Meridian's, where they use brute force processing to override the human nervous system. Mr. Thompson developed collaborative algorithms that work with existing neural pathways. Judge Morrison looked intrigued. Can you elaborate on that distinction? Ms. Kim. Certainly, Your Honor. I'd like to call Sophie Sterling to the stand. Jack watched nervously as Sophie moved forward in her exoskeleton. She'd insisted on testifying despite his concerns about putting her in the spotlight. At 17, she possessed a clarity of purpose that reminded him of Danny. Sophie, Kim began gently, can you explain how Mr. Thompson's device works from a user's perspective? Sophie nodded, her voice clear and confident. The exoskeleton doesn't control my movements, it amplifies them. I think about walking, and the system helps me execute that movement. I'm always in control. Have you tried other mobility assistance devices? Yes. Before meeting Mr. Thompson, my mother and I tested several commercial exoskeletons, including 2 from Meridian Medical. Sophie's expression grew serious. Those devices felt like I was being carried by a robot. Mr. Thompson's system feels like I'm walking with a very responsive dance partner, Bradford objected. Your Honor, the witness lacks the technical expertise to understand the underlying algorithms. Judge Morrison sustained the objection, but Jack could see that Sophie's testimony had made an impact. She wasn't just describing technology, she was describing the difference between being helped and being controlled. Kim called several more witnesses, Dr. Chen testified about the medical benefits of Jack's approach. Miguel demonstrated the athletic capabilities of his customized system. Tom from the auto parts store described delivering components to Jack throughout the development process. Each piece of testimony built a picture of organic innovation, a brilliant engineer working in his garage to solve human problems, not a corporate conspiracy to steal trade secrets. Then came the moment Jack had been dreading. Dr. Richard Vaughn took the stand for Meridian, armed with technical diagrams and code comparisons. Dr. Vaughn, Bradford said, have you analyzed Mr. Thompson's neural interface algorithms? I have. The core processing routines are virtually identical to our proprietary code. The variable naming conventions, the commenting structure, even specific optimization techniques, they're all taken directly from our research. Bradford displayed side-by-side code comparisons on the courtroom screen. To Jack's untrained eye, they did look remarkably similar. In your professional opinion, could these similarities be coincidental? Absolutely not. The probability of independent development producing such identical code is statistically impossible. Jack felt his heart sinking. He didn't understand enough about software copyright to know if his attorney could counter this technical testimony effectively. But when Kim cross-examined Dr. Vaughn, she took a different approach entirely. Dr. Vaughn, how many years of military engineering experience do you have? None. My background is in computer science and biomedical engineering. Have you ever built a mobility assistance device from salvaged components? No. Our development process uses purpose-built materials and standardized components. Kim nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Vaughn, I'm going to show you something. She clicked her remote, and the screen filled with photos from Jack's garage, his workbench covered with salvaged motors, his notebooks filled with hand-drawn sketches, his prototype devices held together with improvised brackets and custom machine parts. This is how Mr. Thompson's technology was developed. Not in a corporate laboratory with unlimited budgets, but in a garage where every component had to be adapted and every solution had to be creative. She advanced to the next slide, showing Jack's algorithm code alongside Meridian's. But this time, she highlighted the differences instead of the similarities. Dr. Vaughn, do you see these optimization routines? The ones you claim Mr. Thompson stole from your research? Yes. Can you explain why Mr. Thompson's version is actually more efficient than yours? Vaughn hesitated. That would require more detailed analysis. Let me save you the time. Mr. Thompson's code is more efficient because he developed it under constraints you never faced. He had to make it work with salvaged components and limited processing power. That constraint drove innovation that your well-funded laboratory never achieved. Judge Morrison leaned forward with interest. Are you saying that Mr. Thompson's technology is superior to Meridian's? Kim smiled. I'm saying that true innovation often comes from necessity, not corporate research budgets. And the proof is in the results. She gestured towards Sophie and Miguel. Two young people who were told they'd never walk again are now not just walking, but thriving. That didn't happen because someone stole corporate code. It happened because a gifted engineer refused to accept the word impossible. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Morrison considered the evidence. Jack could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that the future of his technology and the futures of everyone it might help hung in the balance. I'll render my decision tomorrow morning, Judge Morrison announced. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria approached Jack with an expression he couldn't read. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, you should know that you've already won the only victory that really matters. Jack looked at Sophie and Miguel, both moving with confident grace in their exoskeletons, both living proof that sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected places. Win or lose, he replied. At least we know the technology works, and that's something no court decision can take away. But as they prepared to leave the courthouse, Victoria stopped him with a hand on his arm. Jack, she said, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned before, but I wasn't sure how you'd react. Jack looked at her expectantly, noting the nervous tension in her voice. I've been making some arrangements, she continued. Regardless of how this legal battle turns out, I want to make sure this technology reaches the people who need it. She pulled out a folder of documents. I've been quietly purchasing property around Austin warehouse space, office buildings, manufacturing facilities, and I've been recruiting a team of engineers and medical professionals who believe in what we're doing." Jack stared at her. "Victoria, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to start a company with you, not just to manufacture devices, but to train other engineers in your methods, to create a network of workshops where people can get truly customized solutions instead of one-size-fits-all products." She handed him the folder. "Thomson Sterling Adaptive Technologies, 50-50 partnership. You handle the engineering and training. I handle the business and logistics." Jack opened the folder, scanning legal documents that represented a future he'd never dared to imagine. "Victoria, this is incredible. But why you could license the technology and make a fortune without all the complexity of actually helping people." Victoria looked at Sophie, who was demonstrating her exoskeleton's capabilities to a group of reporters who'd followed them outside. "Because 6 months ago, I thought I'd lost my daughter forever," she said softly. "Not to death, but to despair. You gave her back not just her mobility, but her hope, her dreams, her sense of possibility." She turned back to Jack, and he saw tears in her eyes. "I've spent my whole career building things that make money. I want to spend the rest of it building something that makes a difference." Jack thought about Danny, about the letters his son had written about finding meaning in service to others, about the satisfaction of using your skills to solve problems that mattered. "There's one condition," he said finally. Victoria looked nervous. "What's that?" "We keep the garage. No matter how big this company gets, I want to keep working in that garage. Some problems are best solved with hand tools and intuition, not corporate infrastructure." Victoria laughed, relief evident in her voice. "Deal, though I reserve the right to install better coffee machines." As they shook hands outside the courthouse, Jack realized that regardless of tomorrow's legal decision, his life had already changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. 6 months ago, he'd been a struggling mechanic trying to keep his lights on. Now he was apparently about to become the co-founder of a company dedicated to revolutionizing mobility assistance technology. But the most important change wasn't professional, it was personal. For the first time since Danny's death, Jack felt like he had a mission that mattered, a way to honor his son's legacy of service while using his own skills to help people reclaim their dreams. Tomorrow's verdict would determine the legal future of their technology. But tonight, Jack knew that the real victory had already been won in the form of two young people who were walking when everyone else had said it was impossible. Sometimes the biggest surprises weren't the ones that changed your circumstances, they were the ones that reminded you who you were meant to be. 6 months later, Jack stood in the main workshop of Thomson Sterling Adaptive Technologies, watching a dozen engineers work on various stages of device development. The facility was a perfect blend of high-tech manufacturing and traditional craftsmanship, 3D printers, and CNC machines sharing space with traditional hand tools and workbenches. The legal battle with Meridian had ended in their favor, with Judge Morrison ruling that Jack's technology represented genuine innovation rather than theft. But more importantly, the publicity from the trial had brought their work to the attention of people who needed it most. "Morning update," Victoria announced, entering the workshop with her usual purposeful stride. She carried a tablet displaying the latest production numbers and client requests. "We've got 12 devices in various stages of completion, 34 people on the waiting list, and inquiries from rehabilitation centers in 6 countries. Jack nodded, still amazed by the scale of what they'd built. The core team now included 8 engineers trained in his methods, 4 medical consultants, and a growing network of partner workshops across the United States. "How's the training program coming along?" he asked. "Better than expected. We've got engineers from universities and medical device companies applying for our certification program. Apparently, the word is getting out that we're doing something different here." Sophie entered the workshop wearing her latest exoskeleton version, 4.0 lighter and more responsive than the original. She'd started college the previous month, studying biomedical engineering with a focus on adaptive technologies. Her transformation from patient to partner to innovator represented everything Jack had hoped their work could achieve. "Miguel's here for his final fitting," she announced, and he brought visitors. Miguel appeared in the doorway with three other young veterans, all wheelchair users, all carrying themselves with the alert bearing of soldiers. Word had spread through veteran networks about Miguel's success, and they'd begun making pilgrimages to Austin to see if Jack's technology might work for them too. "Jack," Miguel called out, "meet my squad. They've all seen the videos, but they wanted to see the real thing in person." Jack watched Miguel move across the workshop with athletic grace, his exoskeleton responding so naturally to his intentions that it looked like an extension of his own body rather than a mechanical device. He'd returned to playing basketball, both recreationally and in adaptive sports leagues, inspiring other veterans to reconsider what was possible after injury. "Before we start consultations," Victoria interrupted, "I have some news. The VA has approved funding for a pilot program. They want to establish 5 Thompson Sterling workshops at major medical centers, specializing in veteran rehabilitation." Jack felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with responsibility. Each success brought new opportunities to help people, but also new challenges in maintaining the personalized approach that made their technology effective. "We'll need to be careful about scaling," he cautioned. "The moment we start treating people like production units instead of individuals, we've lost what makes this work." "Agreed," Victoria replied. "That's why we're growing slowly, training people in your methods rather than just licensing the technology." A commotion near the front of the workshop drew their attention. Dr. Chen had arrived with a news crew in tow, apparently for a follow-up story about their work. Jack sighed. He'd never gotten comfortable with media attention, but he'd learned to tolerate it as the price of reaching people who needed help. "Mr. Thompson," the reporter called out, "can you give us an update on how many people you've helped since the trial?" Jack looked around the workshop, taking in the various projects in development, the veterans consulting with his engineers, Sophie working on design improvements for pediatric applications. "Numbers don't really tell the story," he said finally. "Each device we build is unique, designed for one person's specific needs and dreams. So far, we've completed 47 successful fittings, but more importantly, we've helped 47 people discover that their limitations weren't as permanent as they thought." The reporter pressed for more details, but Jack's attention was caught by something else. Near his original workbench, still preserved exactly as it had been when Victoria first brought Sophie to see him, a new photo had appeared beside the one of Danny. It showed Sophie, Miguel, and the growing community of people who'd reclaimed their mobility through the workshop's technology. They were standing together in front of the garage where it all began, their exoskeletons gleaming in the Texas sunlight, their faces bright with the confidence of people who'd refused to accept defeat. Below the photo, someone had written Danny's old motto, "Everything can be fixed if you've got the right tools and enough heart." Jack touched the frame gently, thinking about his son's letters about finding meaning in service to others. Danny had believed that the best use of any skill was helping people overcome impossible challenges. Now, every day, Jack got to live that philosophy. "Jack," Victoria said softly, appearing beside him, "the reporter wants to know about future plans, expansion goals, technology development, market projections." Jack looked at her, then at the photo of all the lives they'd change, then at the workshop full of people dedicated to changing more lives in the future. "Tell them we're not in the business of market projections," he said. "We're in the business of making the impossible possible, one person at a time." As if to emphasize his point, one of Miguel's veteran friends took his first steps in a test exoskeleton, his face radiating the same wonder and joy that Jack had seen in Sophie's eyes that first day. It was the expression that never got old. The moment when someone realized that their story wasn't over, it was just beginning a new chapter. Outside, the Texas sun was setting over Austin, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Inside the workshop, engineers and dreamers continued their work, building bridges between what was and what could be, one custom solution at a time. Jack picked up his father's old wrench, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and got back to work. After all, there were still problems to solve, still lives to change, still proof to be made that sometimes the greatest innovations came not from corporate laboratories or government programs, but from a simple garage where someone dared to say, "I can help." In the end, that had been the biggest surprise of all. Not that technology could restore mobility, but that helping others could restore purpose. And in a world full of impossible challenges, purpose was the most valuable tool of all. In the end, it wasn't about the technology. It wasn't about the patents or the courtrooms or the billions of dollars at stake. Jack's weathered hands working alongside Sophie's young ones, adjusting a device for another client. It was about a simple truth that corporate boardrooms seem to forget that the greatest innovations don't come from research labs with unlimited budgets. They come from garages where stubborn hearts refuse to accept the word impossible. The original garage, now surrounded by a larger facility, but still standing as the heart of it all. Jack Thompson lost a son but found a purpose. Sophie Sterling lost her legs but discovered her strength. Victoria Sterling lost her certainty but gained something more valuable, the knowledge that money can't buy what matters most, but it can sure as hell help deliver it to those who need it. Danny's photo still watching over the workbench, now joined by dozens of others, a wall of hope made real. Sometimes the biggest surprises aren't the ones that change your circumstances. They're the ones that remind you who you were always meant to be. What dreams are waiting in your garage?